talking about not giving people subsidies where needed, particularly for public education. There are a lot of different ways to provide public education for people. You could give them cash. They could buy schooling at whatever school they feel like. Those conversations have to happen because what has been shown is that the centrally planned command and control public school systems are failing our kids. We have spent huge amounts of money on them. The amounts of money spent on them have grown phenomenally, and you cannot show an improvement in student outcomes. Now, in the private sector, when that happens, businesses don't get any more money from their customers. They have to reevaluate what they're doing. They have to change how they do business, and they have to cut costs. And this is a miserably difficult thing to do. There is nothing harder than cutting costs or changing the way you do things. You all know that probably from your own budget when you got slammed by the recession. Right? So of course government doesn't want to do that, and of course people who advocate for government don't want to do that because it's hard. But you don't get to take more money from people who are suffering through a recession just because you have some vision for the future. And it's a mistake to say that Colorado's recovery from the recession is slow because we haven't invested in education. Those results, in any case, wouldn't show up for decades. So that's kind of trying to switch attention. I think what you need, what is more productive to think about, is that Colorado has a flat tax system, and that's one of the things that attracts businesses to Colorado. Until recently, it was rated number 2 in terms of business conditions for states. A progressive tax system is just like saying, well, wait, you know, we can take a little bit more, and we're not California yet. We can chip away at Tabor, and we're not California yet. But the point is we will be California, and we don't need much more government to provide those services. I don't think we can show that since 2007, when state spending took off, I mean, you look at the graph, it starts out like this, and then 2007 comes along, and the graph goes like this. I don't think we can show any positive results from that. We at the Independence Institute are for evidence-based policy. We want to see results for the money that's taken from us and spent on things, and we're not seeing those. You cannot show that the health of children in Colorado has improved in ways that's commensurate with the huge amount of money we've spent on it over the last 5 years. Because most of the metrics that the state uses are all process measures. You know, did the kid see a doctor? Well, okay, you increase the number of times the kid goes to the doctor, but you don't know whether the kid needed to see the physician or not. In education, yes, we've spent more on education, but can the children read? No. You know, not very well. So there's a problem here with saying, oh, well, just give them more money. They're failing now, so since you're failing now, we hand over more money. I think that the other mistake is to think that the private sector pays for things like educational credentials. It doesn't. The private sector pays for what you can produce, not for what your credentials are. And one of the fine things about the private sector is that you may have no credentials, but when you go into it, if you are effective at what you do, you get paid very well. That's not the way government works. Everybody gets paid the same if you have the same level of credentials, because government has a very difficult time evaluating whether or not the things that it produces are done well or not. So I think it's a mistake to just simply say, oh, well, let's just increase taxes on people who are making more. Because if you pay 5% taxes, if your tax rate is 5% and you make $10,000, you pay $500, right? If you make $100,000, you're paying $5,000. You are paying more in taxes under a flat rate tax system. The only difference is that you don't waste hundreds and hundreds of dollars filling out complex tax forms. So Colorado's flat rate tax is important. The other thing to keep in mind is that people who advocate for higher tax rates tend not to understand what are called flow-through businesses. Small business tends to be an S corporation where all of their revenues end up on somebody's personal tax return. That person looks like he's making $300,000 a year. In fact, he's living on $50,000 a year and using the rest of the income to buy new equipment for his business so he can expand it and hire more people. People like that do not get bank financing. So if you're advocating higher taxes for people at the upper incomes, about 2/3 of the people that you're taxing are small business. And this is something that needs to be talked about.
We have about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So the question is, given that there's no way to change the tax structure immediately, what are the short-term suggestions you would give for this year and the coming year's budget?
Well, I think that the legislature is struggling with that question now. Well, first of all, we have to balance the budget. That's one of the requirements of the Constitution, and so the state budget will be balanced. We think. Well, one of the reasons, I talked a little bit about how taxes have fallen over the last few years. One of the things that's happened that we know is that we've started to exempt a greater and greater percentage of either income and or purchases from any kind of taxes, which creates basically favorable status for certain activities. And, that's all right. That's part of what you can do through a tax code. But during bad economic times, I think there's some real advantages of saying, okay, we may be able to afford to treat certain kinds of purchases or certain kinds of income differently, but we can't really afford to do that right now. So I think closing some of those tax differentials, tax credits, loopholes, et cetera, is one good way. I think that there needs to be a combination of, I think, of course, anything we can figure out to do in the short term to make government or services more efficient is a good idea. I think that we need to, that the criteria that the legislature needs to use is this going to cost us more money in the long run? So that there is an evaluation that says, if we're going to cut reimbursements, one of the proposals on the table is to cut reimbursements for Medicaid providers. Is that going to mean that we're going to fundamentally affect the health outcomes that will mean that the state or somebody else is going to have to pay more in the long run? Those kinds of cuts should be avoided. The primary cuts that are contained in the budget right now are actually going to be coming to the K-12 education system. And I think it's one of the things that's going to happen simply because the K-12 education system makes up such a high percentage of the budget. But I do think that the long-term implications of that are a little bit scary. The other big cuts are going to come in higher education, and that's really moving the costs from the public sector on to students and families. And in the short term, maybe that is about the best we can do because there is another source, and whether people can defer education if that's what they need to do. But I think that those are that's sort of the framework for evaluating what cuts they need to make.
Short run, let's say you can't affect your revenues unless the economy recovers. You need to do what you can for starters to not injure your existing businesses, which provide the jobs that pay the taxes as we speak. For starters, you could increase class size in public schools by 2 to 3 students. That will do nothing to student education in terms of increasing or decreasing it, but it will reduce the number of teachers that you need. You could do the same at higher education. One of the points in the chapter here on higher education, which was written by a University of Colorado professor, is that faculty productivity in higher education has been falling dramatically over the years simply because teachers aren't teaching as much. In terms of things like Medicaid, the state has for some years been directing Medicaid clients towards its managed care system, which is basically federally qualified health clinics are the major providers within that. Under federal law, federally qualified health clinics have to be paid their reasonable costs by Medicaid. Those reasonable costs right now in the state of Colorado are roughly twice as much as a private physician receives under the Medicaid rates currently existing. So what we are doing in state Medicaid is directing patients to a much more expensive source of care than we would if we let them go to private physicians and bump the private physician rates a little bit more like towards what the open market is paying. We shouldn't be subsidizing green energy in state government. We are wasting a ton of money on that. Those programs should be zeroed out. They make no sense. Before we start talking about raising taxes, we really need to start looking about programs that should be cut wholesale, and the legislature can do that tomorrow.
The question for both of you is K-12 education a right or a privilege in Colorado?
Well, the state constitution has a Blaine Amendment, which guarantees, guarantees an education, but it's unspecified what that education should be. Do you teach people to read and write, or do you keep them in school long enough till they've mastered the calculus? There is no answer to that question. That's a question that's solved by policy. It also doesn't say how that education has to be provided. Homeschoolers are showing, for example, in Colorado, and there are a lot of them in this state, that for about $1,000 a year, they can educate a child. Now, if you start taking that $1,000, figure a class of 30 kids, add it up for teachers in a building, a lot of private schools are doing it for much less than the public education system. It may be that that's a better way to go. Douglas County, to its credit, is going to try that experiment. But we have to stop thinking about just doing things the same old way, because they're not working anymore, and just throwing more money into an inefficient system doesn't work. Look, the U.S. has historically, since its government was founded, made a clear distinction between positive rights and negative rights. A negative right is the government shall not interfere with this. You have the right to free speech. That right doesn't require that someone else use his property to ensure your right. When you are talking about a right to education, that means that you have a claim on somebody teaching you. All right? Now, clearly, that's not a right that we would support here. You can't make somebody else your slave to teach you. But we have public policy that says, well, collectively, people think it's a pretty good idea to subsidize education for people, and we will allocate this much money to it. So no, you can't specify education or housing or health care as a right, because that implies some level of slavery if there's no money to pay for it. But you can say as a public policy, oh, I'm getting a look here, like, what do you mean by slavery? Look, suppose you vote no money for health care as a government, and you say you still have a right to it. Does that mean the government is going to enforce my ability to come, you look like you're a student or a physician or you work here, and demand that you take care of me without pay? If the government, in fact, does that, then you're my slave, to really put it in very blunt terms. Nobody is saying that's the case now because we pay for such things. But if we don't pay enough money for those things, you cannot command those resources simply because you have some notional right. So that's the philosophical answer.
The short answer is, one that Linda referred to, is that, in our Constitution, we require, in Colorado Constitution, the provision of free public education for all Coloradans. And they have limitations on age and one thing or another. There's some standards about it being thorough and uniform. And there's actually a court case moving through the system now to determine a little bit more about whether or not our system is meeting the constitutional requirements. I think absolutely it is essential to our freedom that we have a well-funded public education system that is public, not simply in somebody's home or in a school conducted by a church or a church affiliate or a private school with a particular philosophy. I think that I do believe personally, you asked my opinion, and philosophically, I believe that a public education, one free of a particular overriding bias, is key to us having a free and just society. Now, is there bias in everything? Of course there's some bias. But to get to the short answer, I think it is a right, and I think it's a right that is being jeopardized right now because our inability to provide the kind of education for everyone that's going to give them equality of opportunity. And that's really where I come down on the rights piece.